Have you ever found yourself thinking that classic movies are a scam? That some movies are just famous because they're famous or because they're old or were the first to do something that has now been done 1,000 times? Well, if you've ever thought that, you were probably wrong. Most so-called classic movies, most of them are great, at least in one dimension, but usually in several. Of course, not all movies are going to click for everybody at all times, and often these classic movies are from another world, but with a little bit of thought, just a little bit of thought, you can usually transport yourself there. Having said all that, there are some movies, there are a handful that I set out to review for this very channel and that I couldn't even finish, couldn't get through them. Today, I'm going to run through some of those. Since I didn't finish them, my opinions here might be totally whack and completely wrong. Let me know. And if you think I should give one of these a second chance and actually bring it to the channel in a positive light, then let me know. First up is the movie The Way We Were, and it's a movie with a ton of potential. Barbra Streisand, Paul Newman, and a young James Woods playing a typically sickly James Woods character. It's directed by Sidney Pollack, and it's a film about romance between two people of different ideological and social backgrounds. I was thinking it might be the perfect movie for today's polarized political climate. It was made in the 1970s. Maybe it was the perfect movie for, the 1970s polarized political climate. Came out in 1973, but it's backwards looking, and it turns out it's cripplingly nostalgic. The movie mainly takes place in the 1930s, 1937, I think, and this time period provides for some, dramatic irony. It's about some social activists who they're pacifists mainly. They don't want to support the U.S. in any wars. They pledge not to do this, but of course the audience knows that World War II is right around the corner. Is this supposed to be a parallel to 1973? I'm not sure exactly. Not sure what message that is. I kind of like the irony. Not exactly sure what the point is. Is this really what activism looked like in the 1930s? I don't know. This movie doesn't seem like a rigorous historical document. The song from the film, the song The Way We Were, kind of mirrors the movie. It's a cool song. At least the beginning is cool, but then you realize it's extremely schmaltzy. If you want another cool movie with a Barbra Streisand song, check out The Eyes of Laura Mars. I think the theme for that is called Prisoner or something. That film was directed or produced by her then boyfriend, but she declined to star in it. That's not a great movie either, and that's also a film I didn't make a video about for this channel, although it's, in some ways, I think, a lot more interesting than The Way We Were. Anyway, this is a movie that has a lot of potential. It was big when it came out. I heard of it because there's a lot of Trivial Pursuit questions about it, but in the end of the day, it's just so saccharine, and it falls way short of being a compelling historical film. Just go watch Reds, which is a great historical movie, and also it's a movie about a complex relationship between two people who don't have the same ideological background. Like this movie, but 10 gazillion times better. Next up is On Golden Pond, another movie that was a big deal when it came out, partly because it brought together Henry Fonda and Jane Fonda. This movie was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and it won 3, but I could not get on board. For some reason, Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn, that's right, she's in it too, they seem in this movie less like actors playing old people and more like old people attempting to act, struggling to act. I guess it's not hard to see how this movie resonated with people who grew up with them, and maybe it has virtues beyond that, but it just wasn't for me. I could not get into this movie. I couldn't even make it to the point when Jane Fonda shows up. A slightly less famous movie is Awakenings, which is a Robin Williams film about a doctor who helps cure patients with sleeping sickness. That's a disease you don't hear about too often these days, at least not in these parts. This movie, again, has a ton of potential. The cast is immense. Robert De Niro, John Hurd, Julie Kavner, that's Marge Simpson, Max von Sydow, not Marge Simpson. And I think for some people, this movie, it does deliver in terms of emotional intensity. But for me, it was just a little too cheap and not very subtle. I heard that the movie was going to be gripping, but about halfway through, I found myself just not caring at all, and I didn't finish it. Speaking of Robin Williams, I also don't particularly like The Fisher King. I have seen the whole thing, and it has some charms. I like Terry Gilliam. It had some clever stuff in it, but that movie struggles under its own weight, I think. Another movie that I thought was going to be great for this channel was The Big Blue. This is a scuba diving movie starring Jean Reno and Jean-Marc Barr. It was directed by Luc Besson. Before I pressed play, I really couldn't tell if this was going to be an art house film or a mainstream imitation, an impression, an impersonation of an art house film. I'm still not totally sure, it's probably a little bit closer to the fakery side of things. The whole thing, again, feels a little bit cheap, and this is a long movie. But I don't know. I wouldn't say it's bad, but this just didn't quite deliver on its scope for me. In some ways, couldn't get through it. While we're on the subject of fake art house movies, let's talk about a few that I really don't like. First up, The Chorus. I have seen this whole movie. Les Choristes. Man, this movie is not for me. It's basically an imitation of something like Cinema Paradiso, without any of the substance, without any of the subtlety. They even got Jacques Perrin to play the adult version of one of the characters, just like in Cinema Paradiso. But this movie, yeah, it's like a movie made by ChatGPT, just sort of imitating this nostalgic art house film. I have a short about The Red Violin, which is another example of this sort of movie. My question for you is whether the movie Germinal from 1993 is in the same category. Looks a bit sus, but maybe it could be good. Now for a movie I'm somewhat ashamed to admit that I didn't like. It's The Flowers of St. Francis, directed by Roberto Rossellini and co-written by Federico Fellini. This was suggested to me by one of my most trusted advisors in film, but I could not get through this movie. I'm sorry. I almost fell asleep while watching this. I also set out to watch it with my family, and they hated it. So maybe I'll come back when I'm a bit more well-rested to check out The Flowers of St. Francis. It seems, I don't know, seems like it could be something there. I also feel bad about not making to the end of David Cronenberg's Shivers. I watched this probably right after I watched Scanners, which was somewhat recently, and I got through about 80% of this movie, and look, it's pretty good, but I found that I just didn't care about how it was going to end, and I had kind of already seen all the bits in that movie in his later movies. Cronenberg's Cosmopolis, on the other hand, I couldn't watch more than 2 minutes of. I don't know what happened there, but that movie looks absolutely awful. Oftentimes when you see like really conspicuous acting or something like that in a movie by a renowned director, sometimes you got to have some patience. Sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes there's this aura or a doubleness or something like that. Sometimes you're supposed to have some conspicuous sense of artifice in these movies, and especially someone like Cronenberg he doesn't exactly make naturalistic movies, and often that kind of, cinematic something or other is part of the vibe. But in this movie, oh man, looked awful. I wanted to do a video about Robert Altman's Ready to Wear. That actually was playing at Lincoln Center somewhat recently. And maybe I'll come back to this one, but after watching the first 10 minutes unfold with absolutely zero direction, I couldn't really stay for the next 2 hours. Next stop, Greenwich Village, has the trappings of a sophisticated film, and I was interested in this because, look, it's a New York movie. Can't have enough of those. But I don't know. It didn't quite end up feeling very sophisticated when I watched it. Some very basic ideas. Yeah, kind of a gritty, slightly naturalistic feeling in these old apartments, things like that. But at the end of the day, a movie that seems really beholden to the gaze and a very basic story of a guy in the city, I guess. Didn't make it very far through that one. Kamouraska. I don't really know how to pronounce this, but this is an old Quebecois movie directed by Claude Joutre, starring a young Genevieve Bujold. This movie has an aura. It only has 424 votes on IMDb, but if you like old Quebecois movies, maybe you've heard of this one, because it's, I think, somewhat well-known in that micro-genre. It's about a woman trying to get by in rural Quebec. I think maybe she poisons someone, or someone poisons her, something like that. This, again, is a movie with so much potential, and I actually watched the whole thing, watched it on a train coming back from Thanksgiving last year, I think, or 2 years ago. Don't really remember when. It has a lot of potential. It has a vibe. It has an aura. It's a cool historical production. But, yeah, it just wasn't that great, and I couldn't come up with anything to say about it. Okay, I don't want to blaspheme much more. If any of these movies you think is actually worth going back to, I realize none of these are the big classics, but some of these are slightly well known. Oh, one more, The Lords of Flatbush. That's a movie I started to watch for this channel, an early greaser film set in Flatbush. It's got a young Stallone, isn't it? Right, something like that, and you can see the trappings of an icon in this film, but it's just really bad. Terrible movie. And I know I've reviewed some a lot of terrible movies on this channel. But this one, hey, didn't do it for me. While we're at it, I also think The Outsiders is really bad. And while we're at it, I also famously, well, somewhat, am not a fan of Apocalypse Now, although I haven't seen it for about 10 years, so maybe it's time to revisit. And of course, as you know, I hate every single movie made in the 1980s in the United States. So if you disagree with any of those things, let me know. I'll be back next week with another review, and the week after that, 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 and so on. I just thought it might be interesting to mention some of the things that I set out to review on this channel that never made it.